Good evening, everyone. Welcome to The Real Main Street, Part 2. Welcome. Put on the Petaluma Historical Society and Museum is this co-sponsor of this event, along with the Petaluma Regional Library. And I want to welcome you. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are standing physically and virtually on the traditional land of the Coast Miwok people, with gratitude for the care they have taken of it through the generations. This acknowledgement is particularly relevant tonight as we once again jump in to explore Petaluma's historic Main Street, which rests what was originally a Coast Miwok trading route. That trading route was anchored by a nearby village which acted as the hub of commerce, community, and celebration. In this, our second episode, we will explore how community was likewise created during the American settlement of Petaluma as immigrants from around the world stopped by and stayed, adding their own unique perspective and cultural influence on our town. Before we dig in a little bit deeper, though, I do want to do a couple of housekeeping things. I want to mention that this is being recorded and will be made available at the Sonoma County Library YouTube channel, as well as through Petaluma Historical Library and Museum's website. You can also view part 1 of the series that John did at both of those sites. I also invite you to ask questions throughout via the chat. Be sure to open that up. I will be monitoring that chat, and I will set aside time at the end to make sure that those questions get asked. So let's get started. About tonight's presenter. As a fourth-generation Petaluma native, John Sheehy grew up with the stories of his family, as well as those whose lives shaped the Petaluma landscape. In fact, he and his wife live on Sonoma Mountain, not too far from where his great-grandfather settled in 1863. He spent the bulk of his career as an editor and publisher at magazines ranging from Time Inc. to Utne Reader, Fast Company, and Dwell. He and photographer Scott Hess wrote the book On a River Winding Home, Stories and Visions of the Petaluma River Watershed, which was awarded the Gay LeBaron Editors Award in 2019 from the Sonoma County Historical Association. I'm going to hand over this meeting to John, and welcome, John. Let's hear about Main Street.
Great. Thank you, Connie. Welcome, everyone. Well, I'm going to start out today, I hope, get everything working with a story. So in 1866, my great-grandmother, Julia Moriarty, boarded a ship in Liverpool, England, called the City of Dublin, bound for New York City. She was 14 years old. Her ultimate destination was San Francisco, where her father had immigrated 4 years earlier, soon after her mother died. Julie was traveling with her Aunt Mary, whose care she had been in back in County Kerry, and Mary's 3 daughters, all under 18. The women comprised part of the second wave of Irish immigration. The first wave having extended from 1845 through the 1850s in the wake of the Great Potato Famine that devastated Ireland. Now, during the first wave, almost 2 million Irish fled the country. 60% of them went to America. But the bulk of immigrants during the first wave were men, whereas during the second wave, they were comprised primarily of women, most of them younger than 25, and many, like my great-grandmother Julia, still in their teens. In what historians call the feminization of the Irish diaspora, women came to make up the majority of foreign-born Irish in the US in the 19th century. Now, soon after arriving in San Francisco, Julia, her aunt, and her 3 cousins all found employment as domestics for wealthy San Francisco families, like more than 3/4 of the Irish female immigrants. It was work that the Anglo-American girls avoided, as domestic service bore something of a social stigma. even among the Anglo working class who preferred working as shop girls, mill hands, and seamstresses. Domestics maintained a very grueling schedule, toiling 6 days a week from dawn till the dead of night. They were usually excluded from family affairs of their employers, as consorting with the help was frowned upon. It was a tough and lonely existence, requiring, in the words of one historian, the temperament of a saint and the constitution of a cowboy. Now, the upside was the money. While the wages were meager, women earned the equivalent of about $500 a month in today's currency. Employers provided food, lodging, and a uniform, meaning a domestic's expenses were few. That allowed Irish girls to contribute the lioness's share of money sent back home to Ireland to either support their families there or to purchase prepaid travel tickets to America for family members to join them. And that became part of what the Irish premiered with called chain migration. Now, in the years between the Great Famine of 1845 to the end of the 19th century, money transfers from America to Ireland exceeded $260 million. That's the equivalent in today's money of about $8 billion. And the majority of it came from single women. Now, after working as a domestic in San Francisco for 5 years, Julia married an Irish immigrant bachelor named John Casey and settled with him on his ranch in Lakeville. Casey had come to Lakeville with his brother and two sisters in 1863. Now, at the time, much of Sonoma Mountain extending from Lakeville to Pengrove was informally known as Little Ireland. Now, that's because so many of the Irish had settled there on the mountain. Now, some say it was because they knew to take advantage of the mountain's natural springs, and others claim they were excluded from the more desirable farmland settled largely by the Anglo-Americans in the flats. Now, over the next 15 years, Julia gave birth to 6 children. Soon after the birth of the 6th child, her husband, John Casey, died of a bad case of the measles. Julia sold the ranch and moved into Petaluma, where she found support from Irish women in the Catholic Ladies' Aid Society, an organization that she would later go on to become a long-serving officer of. With money from the farm, she built a house on Bassett Street in Petaluma and a spec house on the empty lot beside it, which she sold to an Irish painting contractor on Main Street named Charles Sheehy and his wife Hannah and their 5 children. Sheehy had immigrated to Petaluma from the penal colonies in Australia after the British expelled him there from Ireland as a Fenian or a revolutionary. The story I grew up hearing is that he had stolen a horse, and later that was said to be a British horse. Now, Julia's youngest daughter, Mary Ellen, my grandmother, married the Sheehy's oldest son next door, Charles Jr., and moved with him into the Sheehy household. From that union, my father was born. He grew up in the Sheehy house, surrounded by an extended Irish clan, living in 5 houses on the block. Years later, I would grow up in the Casey house next door. Julia Casey died in that house at the age of 82 in 1934. And through hard work, persistence, and the support of the Irish community, she overcame poverty and adversity to ascend the social ladder and realize the American dream. It's a story that's not that uncommon for many of the immigrants to Petaluma in the 19th century. So this evening, I'm going to continue exploring Petaluma's early ethnic communities who helped to make the city's Main Street, a thriving melting pot in the 19th century. In part 1, I focused on the early Jewish, Chinese, and Swiss Italian communities. This evening, I'm going to explore the early Irish, Black, and German communities. And once again, my apologies to those early communities I don't have time to dwell into this evening. Now, before I start, just 2 notes. First, a word about the American ideal of the melting pot. Now, for most ethnic groups in the 19th century, California was the end of the rainbow. Its gold may have been mined, but the state, still in early formation, offered the opportunity for a fresh start. And that was especially important to ethnic groups escaping political and economic upheaval. many of whom arrived in California with a sense of woundedness and imprisonment, some figuratively, others, like the Blacks formerly enslaved in the South, or my great-grandfather, the Fenian revolutionary imprisoned in Australia, literally. Now, all shared a sense of hope and resilience, largely because of the promise of the melting pot in America. Now, that's best symbolized by the Statue of Liberty, the underlying assumption of the pot being that an integration of different ethnic groups would create a blended American culture, one that incorporated rather than expelled or erased the influences of those groups, making, as in alloyed metals, a stronger bond. Second, as I noted in my first episode, my approach this evening is what's commonly known as history from below, which emphasizes the lives of common people who create overwhelming waves of small events that carry leaders along with them. Now, some historians argue that that was the case with the American Revolution, a revolution that began on the ground level with the reaction to the British Stamp Act before George Washington stepped in to head it. Now, that's opposed to what's known as the great man theory of history, developed in the 19th century by the Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle's theory maintains that people in positions of power are granted characteristics at birth that ultimately make them heroes, in that they shape history as opposed to being shaped by it. Now, that makes their biographies very convenient story framing devices for historians. The problem is it sweeps under the carpet the histories of people who don't fit into the theory. Now, in the case of Petaluma history, as I mentioned before, great man theory is often applied to a group of early American capitalists known as the Petaluma's Big Five: John McNair, Harrison Meacham, Ezekiel Denman, Isaac Wickersham, and William Hill, 5 educated Anglo-Americans from the East Coast who arrived in Petaluma in the 1850s with money, making early investments in agriculture, land speculation, and banking that made them among the wealthiest men in the county. Well, in 1870, Petaluma's Big Five met their match in an Irish immigrant named Peter Donahue, who came to town to build a railroad. Petaluma at the time was flourishing as the main shipping port for Sonoma County, thanks to, in large part, to the California wheat boom. The boom was initially spurred in the mid-1850s by the Crimean War, which disrupted wheat exports from the Ukraine to Australia and New Zealand, forcing those countries to turn to California for wheat. Demand for California wheat further exploded during the Civil War, which disrupted wheat exports from the American Midwest to Europe. And California grain merchants like John McNair and his brother, George Washington McNair, began shipping wheat via San Francisco to Europe's distribution center in Liverpool, England. Now, millions of immigrants looking to escape political and economic turmoil in their home countries took advantage of the ships returning from Liverpool to gain cheap steerage to the US. A number didn't survive the squalid conditions below deck, and hence their nickname, coffin ships. The Irish, together with the Germans, dominated the immigration arrivals to the US in the 19th century. By 1870, foreign-born residents in Sonoma County made up more than a quarter of the population. A third of them were Irish, followed by the Chinese and the Germans, which were in sort of equal populations. While the Germans initially did better economically than the other two, arriving with more resources as tradesmen and merchants, the Irish gradually gained upward mobility, especially in California, where, like most ethnic groups, they faced less entrenched bigotry than on the East Coast. Like many immigrants, the Irish got their start accepting low-paying jobs that native-born workers didn't want. The women worked as domestics, derisively nicknamed Bridgets, and the men worked as laborers, derisively nicknamed Paddies, building the nation's canals, its roads, and its rail lines. American laborers resented the Irish because they were willing to do more work for less money. In California, the Irish themselves found themselves resenting the Chinese immigrants for the same reason, especially in building the railroads, which following the Civil War began to redefine California's commercial shipping routes, including in Sonoma County. In 1867, Sonoma County offered a subsidy of $5,000 per mile of track. That's about $100,000 in today's currency, for the first railroad to extend from the county's southern border to its northern border. The big prize being access to the virgin redwood timber in the Russian River and the Eel River valleys north. Anxious to protect Petaluma's position as Sonoma County's primary shipping terminus, two members of the city's Big Five, John McNair and Isaac Wickersham, set out to build a rail line from the Petaluma docks to Hillsburg. They found themselves competing against John Frisbee, the founder of Vallejo and son-in-law of General Mariano Vallejo, who was building a line through the Sonoma Valley from Vallejo to Hillsburg, bypassing Petaluma. Now, unfortunately for Wickersham and McNair, they were unable to raise sufficient capital from other locals, and they ended up selling their rail company to an investment company in San Francisco, who in turn ran into trouble and ended up having to sell out to an Irish immigrant named Peter Donahue. Now, Donahue, soon after immigrating to San Francisco from Ireland in 1849, founded California's first iron casting foundry, the Union Iron Works. He then moved into transportation, first with shipbuilding and then construction of steam locomotives, horse car rail systems, and then finally the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad. Donahue wasted no time jumping into the rail race with Frisbee in Sonoma County. By August 1870, schooners began arriving at the Petaluma docks with rails, redwood ties, and Donahue's Irish laborers. The one snag in the deal was Donahue's demand to run the rail line down the center of Petaluma's Main Street, a demand rejected by the Big Five. Now, in a huff, Donahue decided instead to establish a company town some 8 miles downriver from Petaluma, adjacent to the township of Lakeville, to serve as the railroad's southern terminus. He modestly named it Donahue Landing. The town went up overnight with housing for 200 of Donahue's Irish crew. It also featured a machine shop, a blacksmith, a 2-story hotel, a 1-room country school, a saloon, and a stable that doubled as a dance hall. All welcome additions to the Irish farmers living in nearby Lakeville. Now, to connect his trains to San Francisco, Donahue put together a fleet of 4 steamers to ply the Petaluma River, including the Antelope here and the James Donahue, named for his brother. On New Year's Eve, 1870, only 4 months after laying the first spike, Donahue's San Francisco and Northern Pacific Railroad made its inaugural run from Donahue Landing to Santa Rosa. In 1871, he extended the line to Cloverdale, thus winning the county's subsidy. Now, with the railroad in place, the sleepy town of Santa Rosa, which had been outpaced by Petaluma to that point, soon replaced Petaluma as the county's transportation hub for agriculture, setting off a massive boom for Santa Rosa. Meanwhile, bypassed by Donahue Landing as the railroad's southern terminus, Petaluma stagnated. Its population remained flat at just under 4,000 until the early 1900s, when the Petaluma chicken boom drove a spike up in the population. Now, by that time, by the turn of the century, schooners docking in Petaluma accounted for only half of the freight shipped in or out of the county, the other half being carried out by rail. In the 1880s, Donahue extended his rail line to Tiburon, which became his new southern terminus. He had the buildings at Donahue Landing loaded onto barges and shipped down there. All he left behind was the stable and the stable tender's house, ruins of which remain standing there today. Now, a number of the Irish in Donahue Landing also stayed behind, perhaps most prominently Donahue's construction foreman, Festus Needham. Now, following the construction of the rail line, Needham moved to Petaluma, where he opened a grocery on the ground floor of the Washington Hotel, highlighted here in the red box, which sat beside John McNear's new Bank of Sonoma County at the corner of Washington and Main Streets, where the Bank of America sits today. Like other merchants, Needham quickly became involved in local politics. Now, the Irish had a leg up here because being English-speaking citizens, they also had an understanding of the U.S. political system, which was based in part on the British system that they came from. So they were able to exert political power sooner than most other immigrant groups. Now, although a large group of the local Irish were registered Democrats, which was the party aligned at the time with the Confederate South, during the Civil War, they had actually sided with the Union. They were called War Democrats, honoring the promise they made as new citizens to defend the U.S. against all enemies, foreign or domestic. In Petaluma, that promise took form in the Emmett Rifles, an Irish militia of the California National Guard formed by John Kavanagh, a local Irish lumber dealer, and Tom Bayliss, one of the town's early merchants. In 1862, Kavanagh was elected Marshal of Petaluma, and in 1866, he was elected Justice of the Peace. Now, he was the only Irish immigrant Sonoma County's Democratic Party ever put on the ballot, aside from the Irish surveyor John Gaspar O'Farrell of Sebastopol, who was elected to the state Senate in 1858. In 1871, Kavanagh joined with Festus Needham, who just moved to town, in forming the Irish Citizens Political Club, refusing any more of the Democratic Party's offers to buy the Irish vote with money and whiskey, until they were willing to nominate more Irish candidates. The club's efforts led to the election of 2 Irishmen to the Petaluma's Board of Trustees, which functioned as the city council at the time in their early 1870s. One of them was Kelly Teague, who was owner of the popular Brooklyn Hotel. After serving on the Board of Trustees, Teague was elected to the role of county coroner, a role he held for about 8 to 10 years, as the Irish began to exert more political power in the county. Teague had spent his first years in Petaluma as a blacksmith and undertaker before establishing the Brooklyn Hotel in 1868. It was first located where the Hotel Petaluma sits today, but in the early 1880s, Teague built a new Brooklyn Hotel on the corner of Washington and Keller Streets, and it was torn down in 1956 and replaced by the Corfu Medical Building, which still resides there today. Now, boasting the stiffest liquor and the longest bar in town, Teague's Hotel was the political and social headquarters of the local Irishmen. It was there Teague and Needham organized a branch of the Ancient Order of the Hibernians, an Irish benevolent society that provided social and economic aid to the newly arrived Irish immigrants, with Needham serving as the order's founding president. They also helped to form the St. Patrick's Benevolent Society, which celebrated Irish culture in the form of art, dance, and music, and organized St. Patrick's Day, a celebration of being Irish with a bit of defiance because of the lingering bigotry in the country against them. The celebration began with morning mass at St. Vincent's Catholic Church, founded in 1857 with largely an Irish parish. The church moved to a new building at the corner of Bassett and Howard Street in 1876 as the Irish congregation grew. That building was later replaced in 1928 with the church that currently stands on the block there, as more Catholic immigrants from Switzerland, Italy, and Portugal settled in Petaluma. Now, after Mass, the St. Patrick's celebration continued with a parade through town, followed by an afternoon of speeches, these being Irishmen, and the Irish music at the Petaluma Opera House on Kentucky Street, known today as the McClay Building. And in the evening, a banquet was held at Kelly Teague's Brooklyn Hotel, and then a ballroom dance was put on back at the Opera House. As with other California immigrant groups, the Irish had their own source of financing from the Hibernia Bank, founded in San Francisco in 1859. That allowed them to avoid borrowing from the Big Five who controlled Petaluma's banks, offering loans at interest rates of between 12 and 20% in order to guarantee an annual 10% return to their local investors in Petaluma. In 1886, Festus Needham retired, selling his grocery to his youngest daughter, Maggie, and her husband, Denny Healy, who renamed it Healy's Grocery. By that time, the grocery had relocated to Upper Main Street across from Penry Park in the building occupied today by the thrifty hippie store. Maggie managed the books and the back office, while Denny, who had worked at Donahue's Landing as an interior decorator of rail cars, dealt with staff and customers. It was a common partnership for many merchant couples in town at the time. Both became very active in local affairs, Maggie serving as president of the Catholic Ladies Aid Society, the largest aid society in town, and Denny, like his father-in-law, becoming prominently involved in local politics, going on to serve on the Petaluma City Council for 2 terms. In 1902, the newly prosperous Healys built one of the grandest showplaces in Petaluma, a Queen Anne Victorian on the corner of Washington and Kentucky streets, designed by one of San Francisco's leading architects, J. Cather Newsom. In addition to raising their 5 children there, the Healys also became known for the popular house parties that they staged at the house. In 1906, the Healys sold their grocery store and went into the furniture business, erecting the Healy Building on Kentucky Street, outlined in this red box. It's now known today as the Gwynn Building, where they opened the Petaluma Furniture Store. 10 years later, increasingly restless, it appears, they sold the store to Klein Furniture and went into the undertaking business. Now, Denny, a gregarious man with known for his sharp Irish wit, was also a sports fan. And he managed what many claim was Petaluma's best semi-professional baseball team, sending a number of players into the majors. Now, this team shot that we have here is the only photo that we can find of Denny Healy, and unfortunately his face is mostly hidden by his hat. But Denny also loved the races, and he kept a stable of thoroughbreds and a kennel of racing greyhounds that he competed with around the state. And then in 1916, they sold the furniture store and they built the Healy Funeral Parlor on Washington Street between Keller and Liberty Streets, going into the undertaking business. They only owned that store for 4 years before they sold it. It eventually became the parent funeral chapel, and it was then demolished in 1976 for the Sierra National Bank building. With their children grown and gone, the Healys also decided in 1920 to downsize, selling their lovely Queen Anne mansion to Frank Blackburn, who was a second-generation undertaker in town, and he converted it into a funeral parlor and eventually became known as Sorensen's Funeral Home. Now, 2 years after selling the mansion, Denny died from an appendicitis attack at age 61. His funeral was conducted in his former mansion. Maggie died 22 years later in San Francisco, where she was living with her daughter. In 1869, the Healy Mansion was demolished to make way for a gas station, an atrocity that sparked the Petaluma Historical Preservation Movement. Years later, the gas station was demolished, leaving today an empty, contaminated brownfield, a sad tribute to the Healy Needham family, who ascended from the poverty of Ireland's potato famine to the heights of Petaluma society. Now, with that, I'm going to explore the next group, Petaluma's early Black community, who were denied that ascent. One minute, just a little problem with the computer. In 1850, George Miller, an educated free Black man from New Jersey, sailed with his wife Catherine to San Francisco, where he opened a barbershop. He was one of only 1,000 Blacks in California at the time. Many were former slaves brought to California by their owners in the South to work as laborers in the gold fields. Although California was admitted to the Union as a free state in 1850, slave owners were initially allowed to bring slaves into the state with them for up to a year's time before either returning them to the South or else granting them their freedom. Many of the slaves were able to purchase their freedom and that of their wives and children back in the South after moonlighting for gold on their own. As news of Blacks finding success and freedom in California spread, the state's Black population grew to roughly 5,000 by 1855. The first trustworthy census of Petaluma we have was taken in 1857. It counted 1,338 residents in town, of which 31 were Black, 23 males and 8 females, comprising 2% of the population. The Black population would only grow to a high of 43, 44 by 1870, creating a small but vibrant community. Most of them were former slaves who worked as laborers in town, with a smaller percentage who were born free and educated in either New Jersey or Pennsylvania before coming to California. The latter included George Miller, who in 1855 decided to move to Petaluma with his wife and their 2 infant children and open a barbershop on Main Street called the Humboldt. Now, Black barbers at the time tended almost exclusively to white clientele. It was one of the few areas, along with the bootblack, livery, and drayage business, that a Black man could expect sufficient white patronage to support himself. Black women also worked for themselves, operating hair salons, dressmaking businesses, restaurants, and hiring out as nursemaids and midwives. In California, access to white clientele provided barbers with economic and social advantages that placed them in positions of prestige among their Black communities, often serving as intermediaries with the local white establishment. Privy to the business schemes and the political maneuvering their customers shared with each other in their barbershops, Black barbers were expected to keep such secrets in confidence, while at the same time serving as a disseminator of local news, politics, and gossip in the barbershop. It was a tricky balance, with the Black barber being called out if he overstepped racial boundaries in his knowledge of politics or business being seen as too extensive, or if his jokes were too pointed. Now, Miller opened his barbershop Main Street next door to today's Putnam Plaza before moving in 1863 across the street into the newly constructed town building. Unfortunately, the only shot we have of the town building is this one from the 1930s. The red box indicates where we believe Miller had his shop. The building was torn down in the 1950s to create the parking lot that still resides there beside the Steiger building. In the 1860s, a Black immigrant from Jamaica named Frank Miller, no relation to George Miller, also set up a barbershop in the town building. The 2 Millers became good friends and allies, both prospering in their respective businesses. Still, they faced unique risk. In the late 1860s, when Frank Miller expanded his barbershop to include a bathing salon exclusively for white women, his shop windows were smashed out by members of the local Ku Klux Klan. Undeterred, Miller soldiered on, further expanding his services to offer white ladies the latest Paris styles from a young hairdresser named Aurelina Purnell, who attended to the ladies in the privacy of their own homes. In addition to being a hairdresser, Purnell was also an educated and trained opera singer who, prior to moving to Petaluma from New Jersey with her parents, had undertaken singing tours of Pennsylvania, New York, and New England. And while working for Frank Miller, she and her sister Louisa began performing at concerts in town to rave reviews before being drawn away to San Francisco, where they became popular performers in Black singing groups. Their turn of fate had a lot to do with George Miller, who served as the Sonoma County correspondent and distributor of 2 San Francisco Black newspapers in the 1860s, the Pacific Appeal and the Elevator, both of which fostered a sense of community for Blacks throughout Northern California. Now, Miller spent 1 day a week aboard the mail wagon, delivering Black newspapers to subscribers from Petaluma to Hillsburg. And his conversations with subscribers along the way often served as a source of his correspondent reports in the newspapers. Miller also stayed engaged with San Francisco's Black community, making regular trips to the city via the ferry. He remained an active member of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME, as well as the Olive Branch Lodge of the Black Masons. Both served at the time as centers of Black activism, which focused on the California Colored Citizens Conventions. In 1855, Miller represented Sonoma County at the first convention held at the AME Church in Sacramento. The group advocated for 4 basic rights to be extended to Blacks in California. The first was the right to testify against a white person in court to stop some of the brutal treatment they were receiving from whites. The second was the right to homestead on public land. Third was the right to attend publicly funded common schools. And the fourth was, of course, the right to vote. Miller continued to represent Sonoma County at subsequent conventions, including serving as president of the executive committee in 1870. And the group fought an uphill battle with their aims throughout the 1850s when pro-Southern Democrats controlled California state government. That changed in the early 1860s when Republicans, then the party of Lincoln, won the governor's race and a majority in the state legislature. By the mid-1860s, the Colored Convention had secured 3 of the rights they had lobbied for. The one exception was the right to vote. Meanwhile, back in Petaluma, George Miller's wife, Catherine, had given birth to 2 more children, bringing the total number of school-aged children in their household to 4. Miller decided it was time to open a school in town for Black children who were excluded from attending Petaluma's public school. In 1864, he created the first private school for Black children in Sonoma County, recruiting a young Black woman from San Francisco named Rachel Corsi to serve as its teacher. 8 children initially enrolled, 4 of them were Miller's. 4 months later, after the California Supreme Court ruled that public school districts were required to provide separate but equal schools for Blacks, Miller's school became one of just 6 publicly funded colored schools, as they were called, in the state. Now, originally located somewhere down near the Washington Street Bridge, in 1873, the school relocated to a former private school on the northeast corner of D and 5th Streets, where the United Methodist Church currently resides. Miller was also instrumental in establishing an African Methodist Episcopal Church in Petaluma, in a building still standing as a private home on Howard Street near Western Avenue, across from what is today's Crooked Goat Brewery. Thomas Ward, bishop of the AME Church in San Francisco and a leader of the Colored Conventions, consecrated the church in 1865, appointing a 70-year-old traveling pastor, Reverend Peter Killingsworth, as Petaluma's minister. A fellow activist, Killingsworth accompanied Miller to the Colored Convention in 1865 as a Sonoma County delegate, where he gave a report. But such activism created divisions within Petaluma's small Black community. That became evident when Reverend Killingsworth invited the editor of the Black newspaper, The Elevator, Philip Bell, to town in 1867 to give a talk on the need for educating Black children as a means of social ascent. The day before his scheduled lecture, the trustees of the AME Church in Petaluma overruled Killingsworth, canceling the talk. According to Bell, they were concerned about stirring up trouble in town. Now, those concerns apparently rose after the California legislature, which Democrats had then again taken control of in the late 1860s, refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, which provided citizenship to 4 million former slaves. 2 years later, in 1869, the legislature also refused to ratify the 15th Amendment, which extended voting rights to Black males. Feeling stymied, Reverend Killingsworth departed in 1869 for a new parish, leaving Petaluma's AME Church relying upon traveling preachers and ministers at the white Methodist Episcopal Church around the corner on Western and Keller Street, in the parking lot of the Petaluma Market today. Largely a congregation of East Coast abolitionists, many in the Methodist Episcopal Church had misgivings over enfranchising Blacks with equal rights. They were all in favor of freeing them from slavery, however. Now, that included Reverend Edward S. Lippitt, who, as Petaluma superintendent of schools, had provided George Miller with public funding for the colored school. Adopting a common position held by moderate Republicans at the time, Lippitt reassured his congregation that extending voting rights to Black men was not the same as conferring upon them social equality. They would, in essence, remain second-class citizens despite having the vote. Now, although he considered Lippitt an ally, George Miller would have none of that. Having served for years in San Francisco's Black militia, the Brandon Guards, which marched beside white National Guard units in the city's ceremonial parades, Miller decided to organize a Black militia in Petaluma. He called it the Colfax Guard, in honor of U.S. Vice President Schuyler Colfax, who, as Speaker of the House, had shepherded both the 13th and 14th Civil Rights Amendments through Congress. During a visit to Petaluma in 1865 to visit a relative living here, Colfax had given a speech outside the American Hotel, which sat directly across from Miller's barbershop, where Putnam Park is today. And one assumes that's where Miller first heard him speak. On April 1st, 1870, the day after the 15th Amendment was signed by President Ulysses S. Grant, Miller staged the first formal celebration of the amendment in the state of California. Festivities began with the Colfax Guard giving a 30-gun salute, one gun for each state that ratified the amendment, notably not including California, in what is today, that took place in what is today Penry Park. Miller then read the amendment aloud before introducing his frenemy, Reverend Lippitt, who in his remarks reiterated his belief that voting rights would in no way compromise the existing social relations between whites and Blacks. He also pointed out that Blacks needed to educate up in order to meet their new voting responsibilities. The celebration concluded with dinner and dance across the street in Hinshaw Hall, which is today occupied by the Lemongrass Thai Noodle restaurant right near Washington Street, with music that night provided by Miller's own square dancing band that played until dawn. Now, when Election Day rolled around in the fall of 1870, George Miller and 13 other Black men in Petaluma proudly cast their votes for the first time. Miller then turned once again to education, using Lippitt's point that Blacks needed to educate up as an argument for school integration, noting that the color schools were providing children with mediocre educations. In 1872, Miller and other members of the Colored Convention's Educational Committee put before the California Supreme Court a test case calling for all children, regardless of color, to be admitted to common public schools, ending the state's separate but equal mandate. And although the court ultimately ruled against them in 1874, committee members used the case and the publicity from it to successfully lobby school districts to integrate their schools. By 1875, San Francisco, Sacramento, Oakland, and Vallejo had all done so. Petaluma, whose school board at the time was dominated by Democrats, was the lone holdout. Their refusal garnered national press as it coincided with the end of Reconstruction in 1876 and the rise of Jim Crow laws across the South. Petaluma's color school remained in place until 1880, when the California legislature finally abolished segregated schools statewide. By that time, its enrollment was down to one student and one Black woman teacher. Petaluma's Black population itself had dwindled from a high of around 44 in 1870 to merely 17, as many families left town for Black-friendly communities in Vallejo and Oakland, where the men were able to secure jobs in the shipyards. In the 90 years that followed, restrictive covenants on home sales and rentals to Blacks severely limited them from living in Petaluma until the late 1960s, when the California Fair Housing Act outlawed such covenants and was upheld by the US Supreme Court. George Miller did not live to see the exodus of Petaluma's Black community. He died unexpectedly in 1873 at the age of 48 while preparing for a colored convention in Sacramento. After his death, his fellow barber and friend, Frank Miller, found the fondness that white men had for their Black barbers diminishing. For some, the financial success of men like George and Frank Miller had come to threaten their sense of social order in Petaluma. In 1881, Frank Miller and his wife departed for San Francisco, where they opened a Black boarding house, leaving his former clients to their new German barbers in town. Which brings me to my final group this evening, Petaluma's early German community. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Germans were the second largest group of immigrants to settle in Sonoma County during the 19th century. By 1870, they comprised, along with the Irish, almost half of the county's foreign-born residents. And as with the Irish, famine, crop failures, and political revolution in Europe led millions to leave the fatherland in the 19th century. Many of them settled in Petaluma's farmers and dairy ranchers, including an estimated 500 who immigrated from the small island of Four at the northern tip of Germany that borders on Denmark. And I make a note of this because I know there's a lot of descendants in Petaluma from the Isle of Four. And my understanding is, although the island was included within Germany's borders following the Weimar Republic in World War I, its inhabitants were basically Danes, proud of their heritage and loath to be confused with Germans for reasons that will become clearer later. Now, many of the German immigrants who settled in the city of Petaluma were skilled tradesmen and merchants. They opened shops on Main Street like Joseph Stagger's sporting goods store, the German drugstore, the office of German physician Dr. Hoffman, the Germania Saloon, Temple and Bowers Hardware, and of course, the Petaluma Brewery. Their skills and middle-class status, along with the fact that a majority of them were Protestants, helped them to assimilate easier into the local Anglo-American society than, say, Irish Catholics. Still, as with many other immigrant groups, rather than fully assimilate, the Germans maintained something of a dual identity, forming German clubs and associations as a means of perpetuating their cultural traditions, most importantly, what they called Vereinwesen, or association life, and Gemütlichkeit, or celebration of the joy of life. Now, these traditions were meant to help counterbalance the Germans' hard work ethic and their sense of thrift with different kinds of enjoyments, but not to an excess. And that included a love of social context, of the outdoors, and of good music. And of course, an integral part of German lifestyle was the beer garden, where on Sundays, both men and women could relax, enjoy visiting with their neighbors, listen to live music, and take pleasure in eating German food and drinking beer, which in itself was regarded at the time as something of a health food. Now in Petaluma, German social life centered around the Turnverein Hall, or Turner Hall as it was also called. Built in 1875 on 4th Street between B and C Streets, it was converted in 1904 into a vaudeville house called the Unique Theater, which unfortunately is the only photo we have of the hall. In 1920, the building became the American Legion Hall, and in 1966, it was torn down for its current use as a bank parking. During the 19th century, the hall served as the German social club, hosting lectures, social events, dances, festivals, musical performances. The club also sponsored benevolent associations, including the German Ladies' Aid Society. Every congregation in Petaluma had a Ladies' Aid Society. The club also welcomed Germans of all faiths, be they Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, as well as Anglo-Americans, who in turn incorporated some of the German traditions they experienced there, including Christmas trees and Christmas gift giving, into their own local culture. Now, at its core, though, Turnverein, which translates into club for gymnastics, promoted physical fitness and exercise, not only for Germans, but for all Petalumans, including the inclusion of physical education in local public schools. And many athletic clubs, as a result, met there, including in the 1890s when the big bike craze started. The Petaluma Bike Club had their headquarters at the Turnverein. In terms of religious practice, German Catholics had St. Vincent's Church, while German Jews gathered in private homes with visiting rabbis. Germans of the Lutheran and Reformed Protestant faiths held services in German, largely at the Congregational Church at 5th and B Streets. In 1893, a group of German Protestants purchased the Grace Episcopal Church on Keller Street between Western Avenue and A Street, which had been built 10 years before, renaming it the German Grace Evangelical Church. It continued as a house of worship until 1857, when Grace Evangelical became part of the United Church of Christ. And today, the Grace Building is used as law offices in town. Well, German merchants had shops all along Main Street. Lower Main Street, which extended from Western Avenue to B Street, abutting Petaluma's early Chinatown, was the German community's social and commercial hub. Its original anchor was the Union Hotel at the corner of Main Street and Western Avenue, where the Masonic Lodge sits today. Now, acquired in the mid-1850s by a German gold miner named August Stark, it was purchased 10 years later in 1866 by a fellow German immigrant named Heinrich Mathies, who rebranded it as a Deutsches Gasthaus, or traditional German-style inn with a restaurant and bar, drawing both German travelers as well as local residents. The same year, a German horse breeder named John Pfau purchased the Rough and Ready livery beside the Union Hotel, where hotel guests parked their horses and carriages. In 1876, he incorporated the stable into a new structure he called the Centennial Building in honor of America's 100th birthday that year. The building was designed in the Italianate style popular at the time. On the first level, beside his livery, Pfau created two storefronts. The first was occupied by Centennial Headquarters, a high-class drinking establishment he created for ladies and gentlemen, offering frequent classical music performances and operatic performances. In the 1880s, it was renamed the Eureka Saloon after Pfau's champion racehorse, which he hired out for stud services at the livery next door to the saloon. The Eureka Saloon remained a mainstay in town for almost 40 years until it was shut down by Prohibition. The other storefront featured the wine store of a German immigrant named Henry Dormant, who established one of Petaluma's first wineries out on Cherry Valley along Western and Keokuk Streets. On the second floor, Pfau created a meeting hall for the new German Fraternal Order of the Druids. Today, the hall is occupied by Yoga Health Studio. In 1902, the Druids Hall became the headquarters also of the German Mutual Relief Society, Hermann Brothers, and they were there until 1930 when they built their own lodge out on Western Avenue and Webster Street. The hall also featured meetings of other immigrant fraternal groups, including the Dania Hall Society and the Swedish Lodge, as well as the Veterans of Foreign Wars. At the same time Pfau was constructing the Centennial Building, Heinrich Mathies purchased the New York Hotel, a working men's boarding house beside the Centennial Building. Renaming it the Cosmopolitan Hotel, he upgraded it into another Deutsches Gasthaus, like his Union Hotel on the other side of the Centennial Building. For the next 6 years, from 1876 to 1882, those three buildings became the commercial and fraternal hub of the local German community. Then in 1882, the Union Hotel was moved to the corner of Main and B Streets, where the parking lot outside the Great Petaluma Mill sits today, in order to make room for the new Masonic building at the corner of Main and Western Avenue. 4 years later, John McNair built the first McNair building to the left of the Cosmopolitan Hotel on a site previously occupied by Chinese businesses and dwellings. And in this photo, In the Red Square, we're looking down the block from the Masonic Building. The three buildings are the Centennial Building, the Cosmopolitan Hotel, and finally McNair's new building. In 1894, a German hardware merchant named Ludwig Gross and his wife Hattie purchased the Centennial Building. They rented out the former wine shop on the first floor to two German brothers, Hermann and Josef Schoening, who opened a dry goods store called the Ark. Josef's son Victor, who eventually took over the store, later moved it to Kentucky Street, where it became Schoening's Fair, and Victor went on to serve as Petaluma's mayor in the 1850s. In 1911, Hattie Gross, her husband Ludwig having died, purchased the Centennial livery, she closed down the Centennial livery, which was a victim to the arrival of the automobile in town, and remodeled the building, redesigning the front in a Mission Revival style and renaming it the Gross Building. In 1928, she erected a new building on what had been the old Centennial livery yard behind the building facing Kentucky Street. And in 1972, Victor and Marissa DeCarli combined the two buildings into a boutique center of shops and restaurants called the Landmark, which it remains today. After Heinrich Matthews died in 1883, the Cosmopolitan returned to being a workingman's boarding house. In 1919, his son Henry tore down the hotel and erected a commercial building in its place. In 1953, that building burned to the ground, after which the site became a private parking lot, which it remains today. Many historians in the 19th century considered the Germans as the immigrant group that best exemplified the melting pot of the American ideal, successfully integrating into American society while still maintaining their cultural heritage. Now that changed suddenly with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. All at once, German ancestry in America became a liability. As a result, many Germans were forced to shed the hyphen distinction of being German American, in order to become fully American. And that included ending public displays of their traditional culture and disbanding many of their ethnic societies. In an attempt to disappear into the mainstream America, many German Americans changed the names of their businesses, others changed their own names. Meanwhile, across the country, there were bans on the teaching of the German language, and even on playing German-composed classical music like Beethoven and Mozart. The names of schools, foods, and towns were also changed. In Petaluma, Bremen Street on the city's old east side was changed to Wilson Street after President Woodrow Wilson. The Anti-Saloon League initiated boycotts of beer and beer halls in the 1910s as a patriotic act, using the war to successfully drive home their lobbying for the imposition of prohibition in 1920. It was a burden German Americans would carry until well after World War II. In essence, a reversal of the American melting pot, which assumes that the integration of immigrant groups without conflict or violence will create a stronger blended American culture that incorporates rather than expels foreign influences. It's an ideal that the country continues to wrestle with to this day. And that concludes my presentation this evening. Thank you all for listening.
Well, thank you yet again, John. That is yet an enlightening bit of information. I only have one question that came our way at this point, and the question is, so I'll still give some time here for anybody that wants to pop one in the chat. But do you have a sense at all of how the Big Five took to these new entrepreneurs, especially the new Irish entrepreneurs? They sound like they came in with some big money at some point, and what was the response? Did they work with them or did they fight them?
Well, that's a good question. There were a couple things going on there. A lot of the Big Five, a lot of it was religion. Big Five were Protestants. A lot of them, like McNair, were teetotalers as well. They looked down upon a lot of these immigrant cultures. I think the fact that, like the Swiss and the Italians, the Irish had their own financing mechanisms in place. So they were somewhat independent in that sense. And I don't see in the history I've seen of the period, I don't see a lot of overlap with the Big Five. And
Hmm.
like I saw when I looked at the early Jewish community, they very much integrated in with the Big Five. They sat on the boards of their banks and whatnot. I don't see that happening that much with the Irish in play. Certainly the ones like Needham were very political at the time. Kavanaugh, yes, he was respected, but even then, the Irish were banned from joining the Masonics by the Catholic Church because it was a secret organization. So they had their own Knights of Columbus fraternity, and that was their network. And a lot of the business network in the 19th century, my sense is, went on within the Odd Fellows and the Masonic lodges and the Knights of Columbus, and that's how they network. And so I don't see a lot of crossover there.
Oh, interesting. Good. I just find it fascinating to see how the Big Five maneuvered around in town. So I do have now a couple of questions here. Can you address the impact of the trestle with commerce and downtown and its importance to our local history?
The train trestle?
That's what I'm assuming. Yes.
The trestle. All right. Well, the trestle didn't come into play until 1922. G.P. McNair, the son of John McNair, built the trestle. And it's largely because in 1903, he located his mill to where the Great Pelham Mill is. He built the Great Pelham Mill, essentially. So at the time the trestle was built, the turning basin was also created in town, which enlarged the access of ships at that time coming in and loading and unloading and whatnot. So the trestle also was related to the creation by John McNair in 1904 of the electric railroad, the Petaluma and Santa Rosa Railroad. So he was looking again for a way to bypass the Northern Pacific Railroad, San Francisco Northern Pacific Railroad coming through, by having an electric railroad that went up to Santa Rosa, but extended out to Sebastopol and back, and was used to pick up a lot of the dairy, egg, and agricultural products. And that was the rail line that came into the trestle and then loaded onto the boats in the turning basin. So it was another chance to sort of go around the rail system at the time that existed at the time. So I think it was very important in that sense.
Yeah. Excellent. We have another question. You mentioned that the Irish sent money home and had banking relationships. How did they send the money?
They transferred. So that photo I showed of them in banks, there was a sign on there for Irish transfers. So they would go and make the deposit into the bank, and then the bank would transfer the money overseas, essentially, is how it happened. And as I said, a lot of them sent back prepaid tickets to come over from Ireland to America. And what was interesting to me in the research, that whereas a lot of the immigrants from Europe in the 19th century returned to Europe after a time in America, for example, one stat I saw showed that 50% of the Italians went back to Italy. Over 90% of the Irish stayed in America and did not return home.
Wow, that's staggering.
Yeah.
Someone asks, John, will you pull the multiple heritages together in a future presentation? For example, or in a future, it says, for example, the Chinese, Irish, Blacks, Germans, Portuguese. Is there a way to pull it together as to how it becomes a Petaluma experience? Does that make sense?
Well, there's a lot of overlaps. I mean, in my first talk, part one, I covered the Chinese community, and all of these communities interact with the Chinese community. And this time I purposely kind of held back from that interaction just because I was trying to condense the talk. But the fact that the Germans were down there side by side with the Chinese, that was very telling in a lot of ways. The Irish were competing against the Chinese for the low dollars as laborers. That was very telling. So there's a lot of most of those interactions are very political in nature. And certainly when the Anti-Chinese League started up in Petaluma in the mid-1870s because of the recession and a downturn in the wheat boom, the Germans, Fau's Centennial Hall became a meeting center, the headquarters of the Anti-Chinese League, even though they were 2 doors away from Chinatown. And likewise, the Irish also engaged in a lot of anti-Chinese activities at the time because they were competing with the Chinese for labor jobs. It's complex. I mean, this is when you get to the history below. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of complexity, and sometimes it's easier to take the great man theory was just taking a guy like John McNair and following his life from Petaluma. It was an easier thread without getting into a lot of the complexities. So there definitely might be a place to see an intersection of all these communities together. It would probably be around politics at the time, though.
Yeah. Again, like last time, there's more communities to talk about, and there is always a hope that you will consider doing another part and include some of these other communities. So I put it out there that your audience is hoping.
Well, thank you, Connie. Thank you for hosting us this evening, and thank you to the Petaluma History Room Library, as well as to the Petaluma Historical Library and Museum. Really appreciate this opportunity. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you. And before you all leave, I just want to make sure that you know that we will be posting this recording as soon as possible on the library's YouTube channel. And the Petaluma Historical Library and Museum, a co-sponsor of this evening, will be hosting it on their website also. I want to be sure that you know to check in with the museum regularly at petalumamuseum.com to keep abreast of their many activities and exhibits. They are open from Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And heck, if you're at the Petaluma Regional Library on a Friday, Saturday, or Monday, stop by the History Room and say hi. See what we have on hand for you too. So thank you all for joining us tonight. John, thank you once again for a fabulous presentation, and we will talk with you later. See you all later.